Ray. So to get underway, I mean, spoiler alert, I think, so if my question that I've put up at the front is, will EVs melt the grid? Then no, I do not believe that EVs will melt the grid. I'm sorry if that's a terribly boring answer to start with. And of course, you'll be hearing lots of contradictory opinion around that. And I'm certainly happy to couch it with, yeah, okay, no, but there are some things that we do need to have in place to make sure that we don't melt the grid. We may want to touch on the issue of electrifying heating as well as when we get to the discussion. And certainly there are some challenges if we want to electrify all of our transport and all of our heating systems as well. But for the most part, I don't think the electricity system's facing a huge crisis here, but there are plenty of challenges that will need to be dealt with. So I'm going to talk first why I'm a fan of EVs, very much coming from my research background. So I'll explain what I've been thinking about for the last decade and why that's brought me to the question of electric vehicles. And you'll hear I'm very much not a transport researcher. I'm an energy system researcher. So I'll explain why that got me onto thinking about vehicles. But first off, let me introduce you to SpongeBob SquarePants, who was my electric car for a 2-year period. When I found myself researching these things, I thought I'd better put my money where my mouth was, but I actually leased this little guy for 2 years. I had to let him go at the end of the lease. So I'm currently back in the bad old world of driving a petrol car. My wife drives a pluggable hybrid, so I do get to do some electric driving soon. I'm trying to get back to full electric as soon as possible. Certainly expect that to happen sometime in the next year. But I'll be facing the same dilemmas that I guess many of you are facing in terms of what's the right car, what can I do with it? We're currently a 2-car family. We probably shouldn't be. Can we get away with just 1 car? Can that be electric? And there's lots of things to puzzle around with all of that. But I said I'd start off by coming from my research and why that led me in this direction. I mean, I should confess that actually before I was an academic, I was a gas engineer. And my career has been pretty much 50-50 split between my time as a mechanical engineer moving fossil fuels around the country and then my time in academia on sort of teaching and research. There was sort of a question that actually pulled me back into the university environment in the first place. And it was at that point in the early 2000s, I'd heard about renewable energy. You know, I kind of knew a bit about climate change. It seemed to be a problem we should think about. Looked like renewable energy should be a good idea. But then one of the very obvious questions was, well, how reliable is it? I mean, clearly the wind doesn't blow all the time. So I was keen to find out more about that. And then in the end, I've spent sort of much of the last 15 years actually researching that question. And if you look me up on the university system and see my published papers, you'll see that quite a lot of them are anchoring on questions that deal about how will the electricity system manage as we bring on more renewables. A lot of that has been working in collaboration with the meteorologists at Reading. So I'm very glad to say that there were some proper scientists with some real expertise actually understanding weather behind a lot of the work that we've published. And sort of morphed from in the early sort of 2010 to 2015, we were very heavily focused on wind. And then from there, we realized that actually solar generation was growing much more quickly and was much more feasible in the UK than we'd maybe realized before. So we got very interested in wind and solar interactions. And it was always my plan to understand how those things behaved first, understand what the problems for the power system were, and then get into what can we do about it. And it's the question of, if we're going to have far more renewables in the system, what can we do about it, that actually led me to be interested in the question of electric vehicles. More of that in a minute. But first off, let me show you a very, this is almost an old world way of thinking about electricity demand, but it's a good scene setter. This is a picture of typical domestic electricity demand within a day. starting and ending at midnight. It's in 48 half-hourly blocks because we trade electricity in half hours. And you'll see overnight, the demand is quite low. It even drops off late in the night before it picks up at breakfast time. And anybody who's paid any attention to this subject probably realizes that our biggest demand for electricity tends to come in the early evening. Actually, it's particularly an early evening in winter when we all get home from work, turn on our lights, turn on heating and cooking, and that's when the system faces the biggest stress. This, however, is a much more complicated view of the world, and this is the sort of challenge that's emerging from that research I was describing. This picture is showing you the carbon intensity of electricity generated on the UK system. So it's a square plot showing every half hour within a year. If you read from the top down to the bottom, then you're reading through days in the year. If you read from left to right, then you're looking at half hours in the day. So any slice in it is quite close to this thing. It's showing you the half hours in a day. Just if it helps anchor further, then think of the corners as being midnight in the middle of winter, and the very center of the plot is the middle of the day in the middle of the summer. This varies a lot now. So you hopefully all appreciate that we're using a mix of energy sources to get our electricity from, and it's constantly shifting. There's still a little bit of coal in the system, there's quite a lot of gas in the system, there's some nuclear, and wind power and solar in particular are coming and going all the time. So the electricity that we use at any one moment has a different level of carbon emissions that you can attach to it. And that is becoming a really interesting indicator for me of the things that we need to do to keep our grid in balance going forwards. So this plot is showing you a carbon intensity varying from about 100 at its lowest up to well above 400, 450 in the worst half hours. And just I realize this will be quite small to some of you. So this is 2019's picture. I'm still using pre-pandemic data because it's a lot easier to detect the long-term trends. Last year was a very strange year indeed. So it's difficult to draw quite so clear conclusions from 2020. But this is showing you some significant points that I'd want you to take away. Carbon intensity is still higher in winter. So when electricity is demand, we see carbon intensity at its, when electricity demand is its highest, so we see carbon intensity at its highest. It's a good idea to try to avoid using electricity in those periods. It helps the grid stay balanced, and also from an environmental point of view, that's the worst time to be using electricity. Solar has become increasingly significant in the UK system. So you should be able to see that there's more of a blue band in the middle. I realize it does depend a little bit on colors on your screen and things, but you actually do see now in the middle of the day through quite a lot of the year, carbon intensity is reduced by solar generation. And then I think the other thing that I want you to take away from this plot is that you see quite a lot of horizontal stripes. And you sort of need to trust me that they represent several days at a time often. And this is a real reflection on how wind generation behaves. And it should be fairly intuitive to you that often we get a few windy days on the trot, but then we might find we've got a few days on the trot where it's not so windy. And that is now reflected in the electricity system. The grid mix that's fueling our industry, fueling our homes, actually reflects that pattern in wind generation, where you'll have a few windy days in a run, and then you'll have a few days in a run where it's not so windy. But if you reflect on that for a moment, you can see how it starts to inform some of the things that we might want to do to help support the electricity grid. So electricity storage becomes very interesting, but actually it's really expensive to build batteries big enough to store electricity across several days at a time. And then, so there's this whole question then of what can we do to keep the grid in balance, where we've got this sort of multi-day pattern going on. And I'm delighted that the gas supply thing has hit the news since I agreed to do this presentation, and rather puts a sharp focus on some of these questions. I mean, at the moment, we have an electricity system in the UK that is dominated by wind and gas. So we are utterly reliant on natural gas to balance the system when it's not so windy. I think wind is a great thing. It's our cheapest way of getting energy, but we've got to accept that it's very, very hard to run a system on wind alone. We need to do things to balance that out. At the moment, it's natural gas, but we'll need to get smarter than that going forwards, which is one of the areas where electric vehicles come in for me. A feature of electric vehicles is they've got very big batteries in them, and they're largely being funded by private money. And typically, we don't actually use our vehicles a lot of the time. So there's an awful lot of spare capacity there in the batteries in our electric vehicles if we can use that to help support the power grid. So that's the story that brought me into thinking about vehicles. It was very much concern about renewables, renewable growth, well, affection for and concern about. And my interest was to what extent can cars be a solution to that? Right, I should say first, I love this picture. This is, it's called a Sankey diagram. If you've not come across these before, it shows you the entire energy flow in the UK system. I will be very surprised if you can read any of the numbers, and I really don't intend to keep it up there on the screen long enough for you to see all the detail. But you're pleased to see. If you want to go and find it, it's out there on the internet. This is produced by the UK government. It's updated every year. If you simply search on energy flow chart, you will find this thing quite easily. So if you're interested in energy supply, then I strongly suggest you get your own copy and have a prod around this thing. But the main drift for the moment is, if you can see the colors, there's a very dominant purple band across the top. You can see a few things going on in the middle, but there's a sort of pinky magenta band that appears from an orange box in the middle and heads off to the right. And then the other big band down the bottom is the sort of greeny turquoisey band. So those are natural gas flows across the top, the electricity system in the middle, and the oil system down at the bottom in the green and turquoise. And you get a very quick feel for how much energy we're moving through the gas and the oil systems compared to how much energy we move through the electricity grid at the moment. And I've already hinted that, we're maybe thinking about electrifying transport, but it's not just transport. If we want to decarbonize the UK, one of the big things we probably need to do is electrify heating as well. So that means that we want to move all of the energy that's flowing through the purple and the green bands potentially into the electricity system in the middle. And if you look at it in these terms, that's a huge challenge, right? There's, at the moment, we move significantly more energy around in fossil fuel than we do in electricity. There are reasons for hope. In all of these cases, using electricity is much more efficient for the sort of things that we use gas and oil for. So it's not the case that we need to make the pink band as fat as the purple and green bands are. But it's still no mean challenge that we've got ahead of us. I said in my pitch for this talk, I said I'd introduce you to some of the research that's going on. I'm a full-time academic researcher, and I struggle with this because there is so much at the moment. There is so much energy research going on. There is so much research into electric vehicles going on. This slide I've got up at the moment, I just want you to take away two things from it. One of them is that simple point. there is a bonkers amount of work going on to try and think our way through these problems at the moment. But also there's another information source tucked at the bottom there. I think the National Grid produce a document called the Future Energy Scenarios Report. Again, like that energy flow chart I showed you a second ago, National Grid update this every year. It is a superb exercise, very widely consulted, to try and think through what our energy system might look like over the next few decades. So they think their way around a number of scenarios. I draw on them a lot in my research. They are possible futures, and they think through where we might get our fuel from, what the electricity system might look like. But if I back up on this slide a bit, just in case you're worried that the energy industry is not doing very much, the energy network companies have been funded by the regulator for over a decade now to be innovative. The funds had different names. And in fact, if you've been paying attention to the news, Ofgem made a big song and dance a couple of weeks back about how much money they were funding into innovation, as if it was an entirely new thing. It's not. It's been going on for years. Quite a bit of the work that we've done as a university team with National Grid has been funded through this mechanism. But there is so much more that is being done by the electricity network companies. So this is National Grid, and it's the other companies that own the cables and the pipes. So it's not strictly your energy suppliers, but it's people like Western Power Distribution, SSE Networks, Northern Power Grid, companies like that, that all together band together under the Networks Association. So if you go onto that portal that I've got there and just do a quick search on electric vehicle projects, it turns up 130 of the things. It's impossible to stay across them all. And then just in the middle, this is another arm where the UK government funds industry research through Innovate UK. Just one of their initiatives, they invested another £46 million last year across 40 projects and some big research consortium. So there's a crazy amount going on right now to try and work our way through these problems. And I think a couple of things I'd want to flag. Going back quite a few years in our area, SSE ran the My Electric Avenue project to try and encourage early adopters to trial electric cars, see what the impact on the local grid was. There have been a few iterations of that kind of work since. These days, Western Power Distribution are running a project that they call Electric Nation, and there are a few hundred users connected to that scheme. It was originally just trying to explore how people would use their electric cars, whether we could control the charging of those cars. But in its latest phase, it's now exploring two-way connection. So can we actually take electricity back out of car batteries and put it back into the grid? I'm slightly cynical about that at a home level. I think it could be a useful way to power our homes in the future. There are reasons why I'm not quite so convinced that we'll push lots of electricity back into the grid through that means. But let's be clear, most of us in this territory are wrong quite a lot of the time. And I'm just one voice, and I'm very, very happy to be proved wrong on that particular point. Nothing that was on that last slide really covered academic research. The universities are funded through other streams to the things that I just showed you. There's quite a lot of money coming through the UK research councils into universities. And there are a number of big centres and energy consortia, and most universities have got some kind of energy research going on, and quite a lot of them have got some kind of interest in electric vehicles. Here are 3 projects that I'm involved in. CREDS is a national consortium of energy demand researchers. It's run out of Oxford. It's got a couple of dozen universities involved. There's a flexibility theme in it, which is run out of Reading. And there's a transport theme in it, which is the bit where I'm involved. Some of what I'm going to show you in the next few slides comes out of the thinking and the work that we're doing within CREDS. But mostly my bit is about what does it mean for the electricity system if we have a lot more electric vehicles. Jump on to the next project here, SMART, where I'm working with Nottingham and Newcastle universities. This one is where we're starting to get interested in heavy duty. So a lot of the thinking about transport the last few years has been about cars, but actually there are big questions going forward. What are we going to do about trucks, rail, marine transport? Again, my bit in SMART is, well, what happens if we get that energy from electricity? The project's quite interested in ammonia or possibly using hydrogen for vehicles. And both of those things, we can get hydrogen from electricity through electrolysis. So that's one of our possible futures. And another possible future is that we use hydrogen to make ammonia and use that in vehicles. So we'll be analysing what might that look like if we use electricity as the source route for those things. And I want to give a quick plug also to Adept at the bottom, because this is much more local. I mean, Adept is another national organisation of a particular group of directors of planning and transport organisations, but they have got a number of research projects running at the moment that are exploring smart cities initiatives. And one of them is in Berkshire. All these 6 Berkshire local authorities are working together on this project, trialling a number of different things. There's things like pothole monitoring in there. There's air quality monitoring going on. I should also mention that O2 and Siemens are involved in partners. Once more, my bit is on the energy side, that project is fascinating because I'm starting to get a sense of the perspective of the local authorities and some of the challenges that are going to be coming their way in the near future. And I'm sure we'll say some more about that through the when we get onto the discussion as well. While I'm talking background stuff, while I'm sort of just setting the research landscape, there's another bit of the story here that a lot of the academic research at the moment that I'm finding interesting is thinking about life cycle impacts. And we will need to talk more about this in a minute. But I wanted to give a plug for the group that I've started working with in Nottingham, working with mechanical engineers up there. And it's great. I mean, for me as an energy system person, I'm working back with sort of, I mean, I was trained as a mechanical engineer, and I'm working again now with proper mechanical engineers who understand drivetrains. They're looking at how batteries are made, and they're exploring things like what are the life cycle environmental impact of making a car, making a battery, making a car. And the other thing that I hope to be able to do is join that up with some of the transport research, which is telling us about how people use cars. But there's an interesting little bit of snippet from one of their recent studies here. Now, how does an electric vehicle compare with a petrol car? And just this number changes so much depending on what assumptions you feed it with. So it depends where in the world you're making your battery, what moment in time you think about your electricity grid, what your assumption about car battery size is. But this is not a bad figure to have in your head as we go forward. 43,000 kilometers across the life of an electric car, and it is definitely better to drive an electric car than it is a petrol one. So, you know, we all want to be thinking at that point, how far do we tend to drive each year? How long do we tend to keep a car for? Actually, even if we only keep a car for a couple of years and then pass it on to somebody else, how long is that car going to be on the road for? And actually 43,000 kilometers across the life of a car is a pretty low figure. I'm certainly, my driving habit still, I'll go past that in sort of 3 or 4 years. So even on these reasonably stretching assumptions, actually they're quite challenging assumptions for an electric vehicle here. you see clear wins over driving a petrol car in life cycle terms. But super happy to talk more about that later. Can I just pause there and invite questions of clarification on what I've said so far? Because I'm going quite quickly, and if you didn't catch references, if there were any points of detail there you want to query, then either pop your hand up or feed a quick question into the chat. Happy to deal with those. However, if there are issues about life cycle of vehicles and the nuances of that, I suggest that we deal with that in the discussion going forwards. John, can you see the chat feed?
Yeah, Janet, would you like to unmute yourself and put a bit more on your question? Question of whether the break-even is in terms of carbon in that figure that you've just given.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So this study is just carbon. And again, I'm fairly sure that at some point we're going to get on to thinking about lithium and the various nasty materials for making batteries. So there is a need to think about those life cycle impacts as well. This particular figure that I've got on the screen at the moment is just looking at carbon. But absolutely, those researchers do consider those other things as well.
Okay. Steve Carpenter wants to say, will you talk about tidal energy? Is that not? Where does that fit in?
Yeah, where does that fit in? I'll give a quick answer. Tidal energy absolutely fascinates me because of the way the tides behave. It's potentially a very predictable energy source if we wanted to be island Britain, independent from anybody else. Then I'd say it would be an absolutely essential energy source because we've got so much of it and it's so predictable. Yeah. The technologies are very expensive. It's a very big scale option, very expensive technologies. We're only ever likely to get some share of our electricity through it. But we may just find as the challenge of importing gas is rising up the agenda. So tidal energy comes back into the picture again, yeah.
Okay. One question I had was about ammonia, because I don't really understand where that fits in as an energy vector and why you would use it and how you would use it in a vehicle. Is it something that's used in a fuel cell or?
Yeah, so it is a fuel, you can burn it. So ammonia as a molecule is nitrogen and plenty of hydrogen, whereas methane as a molecule is carbon and plenty of hydrogen. So if you burn these things, you get quite a lot of energy from the hydrogen bit of it.
So in the scenarios, is it seen as being burned then?
Well, there are different options.
Yeah.
There are worlds in which you might burn it. There are worlds in which you might actually split the hydrogen off again and feed it into a fuel cell. So there are different routes to be looked at. The beauty of using hydrogen is all you get off the end is water. So if you're using hydrogen as a fuel, you don't have to worry about carbon emissions. If you use ammonia as a fuel, the nitrogen is problematic. It depends on how well you burn it, whether you get nitrous oxides off or whether you just get nitrogen off. If it is possible to use it as a fuel where you just get nitrogen and water out as an end product. So the benefit is it's much more energy dense. You can use it as a liquid in much the same way we use liquid fuels at the moment. You can store energy at higher densities. You can move energy around at higher densities. Minor details that it's poisonous. So yeah, there are some questions about would we really want to use it at all, and which sectors would we want to use it in?
Yeah. Okay. Questions. Yeah, thank you very much. Would you like to move on to the next section of your?
Love to.
Thank you.
So a few things that come out of our research, and then sort of a bit of a tour of the issues that I see coming up, but then let's try and get to the discussion. So what kind of challenges do we face? I said at the start, no, I don't think electric cars will melt the grid. And I said, well, no, but. This is a picture of on-demand charging. So from early experiences with electric vehicles, if we take that orange bit of conventional electricity use, and if we then load on top of it a conventional car driver coming in, plugging in an electric car at home and just charging it immediately they get home, what you see is you pretty much double the demand on the power grid at that peak moment in time. Now, it's quite easy to avoid this. Electricity is much cheaper at night. It's in your interest to charge at night, not charge at peak. There are tariffs out there in the market already that incentivize people to do this. So there's lots of spare capacity in the electricity system as long as we avoid this happening on demand at peak times. And the sort of things that we're modeling, different questions of incentives for charging, different ways that charging might be controlled. But yeah, I'm just looking at my comment here about how equitable will EV charging be. I'm going to come back to these points again in a minute. From an electricity system perspective, the easiest place to charge an electric car is actually at home overnight or during the day, particularly in the summer, because you've already got an electricity supply. You've got plenty of spare capacity away from peak times, and you can afford for your vehicle to hang around for a few hours. So you can afford to charge your car quite slowly at home and charge it over a few hours where you've got spare capacity on the grid. For all those reasons, you can also charge your car quite cheaply at home. So there are incentives to charge off peak. You can get quite cheap electricity tariffs, particularly for overnight charging. And at the moment, the cheapest way to fuel up an electric vehicle is at home on an overnight tariff. What happens if you can't park your car at home and charge it off-road at home? Right? And something like 50% of people don't have off-road parking. So I'm going to come back to the options for those people, but at the moment it looks like any public charging solution is likely to be more expensive than charging at home. So we've already got a headache there, because we're already saying if you're rich enough to have a big house with a driveway and off-road parking and can afford your own electric car, you're going to be able to charge it really cheaply. However, if you're not quite that wealthy and you're living in a smaller house that doesn't have off-road parking, we still want you to have an electric car, but by the way, it's going to cost you more to charge it in a public car park. So there are already challenges ahead with that. Now, I have mentioned that these days I work with transport researchers. For decades, the transport research community has been trying to convince the government that cars are not the answer. Visibly, public transport has many advantages over cars, particularly in cities and dense urban areas. And also in cities and dense urban areas, there are actually better ways to get around, like walking and cycling, that are much better for you. So there are some ironies that we're seeing big excitement about electric vehicles. And I absolutely agree that the one thing that we don't want to see is more cars on the road. Now let's deal with a couple of things quickly. I mean, lots of people come up with challenges that they fire at electric cars. Often I think they're excuses of why not to change. One of the myths that's out there is that electric vehicles are actually worse for air quality, and it's argued that electric cars are heavier because batteries are heavy. So therefore, because they're heavier, you'll get more brake wear and you'll get more tire wear. Well, there's two problems with that. I mean, the first one that I realized from driving an electric car is that most of the time they actually slow down through regenerative braking. So they're using the motor and electromagnetism to slow down. They're not actually using brakes to slow down at all. So in most driving styles, the brake wear on an electric vehicle is actually way less than it is for a petrol car or an internal combustion car. Actually, this is the thing that frustrates me most about going back to driving a petrol car at the moment. I live down in Somerset now, and I drive some hilly roads around here, and it just hurts my soul to use the brakes going down hills and to be grinding bits of metal and throwing all that energy away going down hills, when in an electric car you don't have any of that wear and you're recovering the energy. But the other thing I found when I actually looked at a couple of manufacturers' sites, and I looked at weights of cars. And if you do like for like comparisons, and I showed you my Kia Soul earlier on, and you could look at an electric Soul and you could look at a petrol Soul, same weight. You look at a Golf and you look at a fully electric Golf and you look at a regular Golf, same weight. The manufacturers design their cars to have certain loads on the road and certain sizes of suspension system and things like that. They don't want cars to be any heavier. So we're very much seeing the electric cars that are hitting the roads are actually very similar weights to the cars they're replacing, and in fact cheaper in some of those comparisons I looked at. The problem with weights of cars is people driving big SUVs and things, driving cars that are a lot bigger and heavier than they need to be. It's not about electric batteries. But yeah, let's mention it. There are nasties involved in making batteries, and worse than that, some of those mining processes are happening in countries around the world without good environmental standards. And we're tending to make electric cars and electric batteries in countries in the world that don't have very clean power grids at the moment. I personally don't think those are reasons not to go electric, but they are things that we absolutely need to cast a spotlight on. We need to hold the car manufacturers to account, and there needs to be much, much better control over those things than there is at the moment. And yeah, we do need to think about lithium supply and actually what is the, how big do we want this total worldwide supply of batteries to get? I mentioned the National Grid Future Energy Scenarios document earlier on. Should say one of the other issues, there's a question of, will we melt the electricity grid? So will we try and move too much electricity through the grid in charging electric vehicles? And I've given you the reasons why I don't think that's a problem, but there is lots that we need to do to make sure it's not a problem. Well, the other question is, well, what about the energy that we're putting into the system in the first place? What about the fuel we're burning in power stations? Is it really better to burn fossil fuels in a power station with all the inefficiencies that incurs than it is to burn petrol in a petrol engine car? Now, I had a trite answer to this a few weeks ago, which is the electric car whole chain route is much more efficient. So even accepting that you're burning fossil fuel in a power station and that's losing energy, even accepting that you're losing energy through moving electricity around, the whole system to supply an electric car and run an electric car is still less wasteful than burning petrol in the car is. So even in a scenario where we were getting all of our electricity from gas or oil, it would still be better to run electric cars. And I've hinted that the grid mix in the UK is a mix of gas and nuclear and renewables. The renewable share is increasing year on year, and because of that, it's making it better still to be using electricity from the grid than it is to burn something like oil. The national level problem here is we're basically changing the import challenge. So if you add one electric car to the electricity system now, you will be adding demand. That demand will be met by gas. Over time, we're going to build more wind farms, but if you add an electric car today, then the thing that is ultimately going to turn up and give you more electricity in the year will be a gas-fired power station. So by electrifying cars, we're moving from a world where we're importing lots of oil to a world where we're importing ever more gas, which is an amusing challenge. So this particular picture from National Grid is a worst case scenario of if we don't do anything to move away from natural gas. This is looking at where might we get our gas from in future. The light blue at the bottom is our own gas. And you see that we became import dependent years ago. Right now, it's less than half of our gas comes from our own reserves. And that starts to run out over the next couple of decades. As you go towards the top of this, you see the magenta band, which is sort of third from the top, just says continent. Now, I'll let you mull for a moment. If we're getting our gas from the continent, what does that mean? Well, actually, it means the nice chap that's putting gas into the other end of the pipe over in Russia. Most of the continental natural gas comes into the system from Russia at the other end. So it's a very small share of our gas supply going forwards. But those small shares have the habit of doing things like setting the price. And I want to move on. But we can, again, if people want to hang around after the end of the discussion, we can kick this one around further. There are lots of things we don't know at the moment. So I've mentioned the challenge of charging away from home. There is a lot of pressure on government and local authorities to invest in public charging infrastructure for cars. And I've spoken to a lot of people who use that as a reason to not get an electric car right now. But we actually don't know what people are going to use. You can put chargers into car parks, like library car parks, supermarket car parks, public car parks. You can put chargers into petrol forecourts. You can put chargers into lampposts. You can put bollards in residential streets. All these options are out there and they're all being trialed. We don't really know which people are going to find the most useful, which are going to fit in with people's lifestyles. So there's going to be a lot of money wasted in investing in the wrong thing at the moment. If you're thinking about getting an electric vehicle, then right now, I would say the people for whom it's a no-brainer are those who are in multi-car households, especially those in multi-car households with off-road charging, well, with off-road parking. I'm guilty of being one of them, but an awful lot of my peers are in that situation where the household has more than one car. They have driveway parking at home. Right now, there is very little excuse for not changing one of those cars to electric. But the things that you should be thinking about, I hear a lot of people think, well, I'll get a small electric car and I'll do my little local journeys in it. That's the wrong way of thinking about this problem. You should be looking at the car that will do the majority of your journeys electric. It may not yet do all of your journeys. And I know we're going to talk about motorway, or I'm expecting we're going to talk about motorway charging and things when we have a discussion. I've already mentioned the impact of batteries, but yeah, this is really that point about why I'm arguing for thinking about the bulk of your journeys and thinking about not just getting a small car. When we come to pretty much every low carbon solution, the thing about them is they tend to have their environmental impact up front, and then they tend to have a very low impact to use. And that's absolutely the case with an electric car. All of the impact of electric cars is in manufacturing the thing in the first place. Using it is pretty low impact. And that is the polar opposite to a petrol car. Petrol cars are relatively low impact to make, but really nasty to use. So it's really important that we're thinking about electric cars that are going into applications where they're going to be used a lot. Which is why I say the local shopping and city solution for small electric cars is probably not the answer, especially not in a UK context. I hit the end sooner than I expected to, which is good because I've been talking for too long. We started a little bit late. I've talked for longer than the half hour I was going to aim for. but yeah, let's. I think I'm going to stop sharing the screen at that point, and we'll kick off with a wider discussion, if that's okay, John.
Yeah, Chris, Phil, if you stop sharing the screen, then we can see more people on the screen if they want to put up their hands and want to talk or say something. That's probably the best way to do it. Still can't get everyone on the screen. I'm glad to say there are so many of you out there. But if we don't see you put your hand up, do, as I say, either say something in chat or just unmute and say something, and we'll find you and deal with it. But, so yes, we had someone made the comment about can we have a quick vote on who here currently drives an EV or has installed a heat pump? I don't know how if you currently drive an EV, perhaps can you find the hands in the reactions and put up a hand or something like that?
Yeah, use the thumbs up symbol if you're currently driving an electric vehicle.
I've just seen one person with their thumb up.
I'm trying to put mine up. Yep. But I'm counting a pluggable hybrid there, so I'm already cheating in my answer.
So Rupert has one, Philip has one, Graham has one. So it's about 5 of us, is it? I think probably. Yep, and the other question was, has installed a heat pump. So can we put our, we've got 5 EVs. So if we put our, Massier, is that for a heat pump? Yeah, okay, good. So we've got one with a heat pump and very few heat pumps. Good. Well,
just on the heat pump.
Lots for us to do. Sorry. Yeah. Yes, Phil.
Yeah, I'm currently in a rented house, and we're looking at buying. And I don't know, I might get sharp intakes of breath from the audience when I say we're looking at buying new build. But it's been really fascinating talking to the developers. They're still about 2 years away from building homes without gas in them. Goodness. So if we buy a new house right now, we'll hopefully get a pretty energy efficient house and one that's reasonably heat pump ready, but we'll get one that's got a shiny new gas boiler in it that we've got to think about immediately ripping out and replacing with a few £1,000 of heat pump.
Yeah. So, someone else in chat was saying currently it's good to have an EV because you're not rushing out to panic buy petrol, which of course is an advantage until the grid collapses for some reason, not to do with people charging EVs, but it does happen sometimes. So yeah, Stephen Kerry says 1 car household EV would do most things, but what about the long journeys when there isn't a charging place? So is hiring a petrol car occasionally the solution? Yeah,
so I'm going to give the ivory tower option on this one. But I'm also going to emphasize the ivory tower bit of it, because I had an electric car for 2 years. As an electric vehicle, I loved it to drive, but as a car, I found it really uncomfortable. It had a really bad seat in it. So I chose not to use that for long journeys. And therefore, I never had the full joys of motorway service charging in the UK, which is somewhat checkered at the moment. I mean, my ivory tower answer is that electric cars that you buy these days have got a range that nobody should be driving without stopping anyway. So you should be stopping for a break. And when they work with rapid charging, you can put an 80% charge into that car in 20 to 30 minutes, which frankly is the time that it takes you to get into a motorway service station and go to the loo and maybe buy a coffee and get back to your car. So there is the electric vehicles that are at market right now will do a lot more of your journeys than you think they will if you just pull motorway service charging into the picture. Janet Barlow's just feeding into the chat. I know that they've had some more interesting experiences of driving an electric camper van, trying to get up to Scotland in it. And maybe we'll invite Janet to say a few words if we've got time on that, John. But
Yeah.
yeah, there is some checkered reliability of chargers at the moment. And also, when you get away from the motorway services, you're finding a whole range of experience of the chargers that you might find and the speed of those chargers. So, I mean, I think I really advocate mainstream people who are doing a lot of driving should be getting electric cars and using them to do the bulk of their journeys. And frankly, there are enough people in that situation that is way above the electric cars that are currently being sold. There's more than enough there to drive demand of electric cars for the next few years. And from that then pushes the demand for charging solutions. And also we work out what people actually want to use. But yeah, for the idealists among us who want to go electric, but aren't in some of the, have the luxury of off-road parking at home, it's more challenging.
Right. Julian, do you want to unmute and ask your question yourself, or?
Thank you. All right. Yeah. So, sorry, once again, I've only managed to join you after the presentation was nearly finished. Electric car clubs, you know, like co-wheels and the different ones. I think they're going to be so valuable in this rollout of electric cars because they're ideally suited. You know, they get high utilization, or potentially can, and they you know, whenever they go back, they've got a charging point sort of ready for them. And it takes the hit off, you know, having to buy new ones. And yeah, I'm wondering what in your work, if you've seen any academic work about, you know, promoting these and how these are going to be important in the electric car revolution.
I mean, yes, totally. So you'd have missed me say, Julian, that I'm an energy system researcher rather than a transport researcher. But a lot of my colleagues in the transport research community have been advocating exactly that for years now. And when you look at some of the things that we realize about electric vehicles and the upfront environmental impact of making one, then your point's even more on the money, because you want to go for less vehicles that are used more. And therefore, car sharing, car clubs help in that scenario. We got an interesting little conundrum that I've realised the local authorities are facing. I was a little bit slow to twig. You know, I'm saying this won't be a problem for the grid because we can charge off peak, and that's great when you're charging at home. But if we reckon that, you know, maybe half of people won't be charging at home and will be relying on public charging solutions, at the moment they are all on demand solutions. So when you plug your car in, it charges. And unfortunately, the car club cars are the absolute worst for when it hits the grid. So we've got a minor technical problem to sort out there that we do need. I mean, I absolutely think we should be advocating for more use of car clubs. Yes, it's a marriage made in heaven with electric vehicles.
Yeah, I'm in Swindon at the moment, and we just got 3 of them. I don't know how many you got in Reading, but it's definitely something to try and promote in Reading folk, perhaps.
Yeah. But we also need to start thinking about when they're charged and try and integrate off-peak charging into those schemes.
Right. Certainly a good point there. And perhaps if we get autonomous vehicles, they can drive themselves around to your place and you can then take them off where you want to. But anyway, I think Rupert Wilson had a comment about his commuting styles and being able to. Rupert, do you want to unmute and tell us about it?
Yeah, well, just really that I've done my bit. I've got solar panels, I've got a battery as well, and I've got the car. But it's only a modest car. It's only got a 28 kilowatt battery and a range in the summer of 150 miles. But it's perfectly adequate for my needs. And as I say, the ability of charging at home on the days I'm not commuting for essentially 0p a kilowatt, although in reality there obviously is the return on investment for the battery and the solar, but that's great. But again, also using an off-peak time of use tariff overnight, even in the winter months when it's less sunny, at 5p a kilowatt is it's made my sort of commuting costs very small. So I
Right.
can't really recommend it.
Very good.
John,
yeah.
I just want to, I'd love to pick up on that sort of, description of a modest electric car with a 28 kilowatt hour battery, because herein is one of the things that terrifies me at the moment. There's, everybody who thinks about electric cars has heard about range anxiety. We were all frightened that the thing won't go as far as we want it to. And this is driving a big market pull for electric cars with ever longer ranges and thereby ever bigger batteries. And unfortunately, the nature of the UK is there's quite a lot of private money around, and there's a lot of money to spend on cars, and quite a lot of people who don't particularly care about buying the cheapest, most right-sized car, as seen in people buying cars with ever bigger engines in the past. You can drive 150 or 200 mile an hour on a road network that's limited to 70 mile an hour. We are in real danger of seeing the same thing with batteries. We're in real danger of seeing the manufacturers produce cars with very big batteries because that seems attractive and because people can afford them, which then means we're going to have incurred all of the environmental impact of making those lithium-ion batteries that then sit there being unused for most of the time. And I mean, in a little way as we can as academics to promote these questions and push back and communicate on these. I mean, I think this will be the one that I'm really trying to raise awareness around. We want to be thinking about electric cars that are the right size for our uses. And most of our journeys will actually be met by, sorry, it was Rupert's, wasn't it? A 28 kilowatt hour battery getting 3 to 4 miles per kilowatt hour does the vast majority of your journeys. Okay, maybe you'll feel more comfortable going to 40, 50 kilowatt hour and getting out to 150, 200 mile ranges. But we should not be going further than that. And there's a real danger that the market will.
Right, that sort of leads us back into the range anxiety thing, and Janet Barlow had a story to tell there. I think, Janet, would you like to unmute and tell us a bit more about how the realistic thing about trying to drive to Scotland?
Do you want? Hello there. There's Janet and Tim on the call here. Tim did a lot of the driving and charging, so he might chip in. I think the charging network is a bit of a mess. That was either it's difficult to access the charger if you haven't got a card to wave at it. So you signed up to a particular network. There's so many different networks. The supports, the telephone support to actually deal with maintenance problems was sometimes very poor. And sometimes you turned up and there weren't insufficient chargers at a particular location. So we did get stuck for a couple of hours because we just had to wait. One of the charging points was broken, and there was a queue of people for the other one. So the charging network is just so piecemeal, and it's really deficient at the moment. So what needs to happen I saw a government report saying it needs to be 10 times the size, 10 times the number of charging points. But who's got to invest, or does the government need to intervene? And because if the charging points are not there, nobody's going to want to drive those long distances.
Yeah, and just to add from my point, we went up to Scotland, and Scotland has one brand, Charge Place Scotland, which controls, I think, all the public charging points in Scotland. And so you have one app for all the charging places, one card for all the charging places. In theory, it's moving to one helpline phone number when the charger is down, which is quite a lot to ring. Whereas in England, we've gone for a real neoliberal approach where there are well over half a dozen different companies with different cards, different apps, different support phone numbers, different qualities of chargers, different types of connectors, different predictability of whether the chargers are going to be offline. But yeah, and so Scotland is really leading the way. And part of that, I think, is the large number of tenements in Glasgow and Edinburgh. there's had to be a load of public charging points put in because they have a very, very different housing structure.
Yeah, I happened to be looking into this a couple of months ago, and I think York has done something rather different to a lot of places, again in public supply of charge points rather than relying on people doing things in their homes. But of course, that we don't all want to drive into a large city if we're trying to get up a motorway. Should that be what we're trying to do? Yes, so I've got a technical question now from Steve Carpenter, which is saying if everyone's on my streets is on the same phase as charging at 7 kilowatts, will the cables support the load? And I don't know, how far have we got on that, Phil?
Yeah, I mean, there was so much I could have said around when I was showing the slides with profiles on earlier at the moment. So one of the things that we're doing in the CREDS work is we're building a model that allows us to play with exactly these kind of questions. You know, at what point do cars start to break the grid? You know, if we get a large cluster of electric vehicles appear in one street at once, is that a problem? Does it ever start to cause problems higher up the voltage tiers in the electricity system? And one of the things that's slightly frustrating is quite a lot of the time the answer is just no. But we're struggling a bit to find good data because it's not always well known what the headroom is. And even down to these levels of actually the distribution networks don't know which phase individual houses are connected to. So it is possible that, you know, by bad luck, a lot of the electric cars that you drop into one street all land on a single phase. But there's a lot of work moving forward to spot these things happening, to add monitoring onto substations, to even do some of the monitoring through intelligent chargers and things. And I think it's going to be pretty rare. Yeah.
Do we need to get more of an Internet of Things on our electricity supply to individual homes, and so we can coordinate these things? Because presumably can the chargers vary the amount of power taken depending on perhaps some external signals, so everyone can get, I don't know, 10 amps instead of someone taking, you know, everyone trying to take 20?
I mean, right. So to me, it's absolutely essential. You know, we need more clever control on some of the big electricity users in homes. And, you know, once people install their own solar systems, then you get interested in this because you want to use as much of your own generation as possible. But once you start adding things like electric vehicles and electric heating systems to the grid, then and to a home, you want to be able to manage the loads that come from those things and to move those loads around in time. The more challenging question is the human thing of how are we going to do this? You know, who is actually going to make the control action, or who is going to have the responsibility for the control action? Is it entirely going to be at the authority of the homeowner? So you set your own programmer, or you turn things on and off when you want to and when you think it's right? Is it going to be entirely outsourced to some other party who you're giving control of the things in your home to turn on and off when they see fit? If it's going to be outsourced to somebody else, then how much do you trust them? What are the security issues? And how much are they paying you for the advantage of you letting them do that? And these things are all being played out at the moment, all being trialed. I don't think any of us know. Well, we will see some blend of these things, and it will come down to homeowners' personal appetites and levels of trust. We will see a blend. I don't think any of us know what the dominant answer is going to be, but yeah, absolutely, there will need to be more smart control in homes, and you know, lots for the Internet of Things there, John.
Right. Going down the questions again. Yeah, Julian asks whether big batteries are useful as vehicle-to-grid storage too. I imagine there will be other methods of storage coming in, and there are the disadvantages that they weigh more and cost more. But is that right?
No, I mean, it's
Phil,
a fantastic question, actually. I'm really pleased that one's popped up. I said I'm slightly cynical about feeding electricity back into the grid from cars at home. But there are a lot of people pushing to make it happen, and it may very well become a thing. I can certainly see a lot of advantages to using the battery in your car to support your home electricity use, particularly if we do electrify heating. And there, at that point, the size of batteries gets interesting, because you can easily be using tens of kilowatt hours of energy to heat a home in a day. So it does get advantageous to have that kind of spare size in batteries. I certainly think that this concept of V2G, of taking electricity back from batteries and putting it into homes or into the power system, it does change the environmental equation, and it does make a much better use of the batteries that we're investing in. So yes, it does make some argument for a bigger battery, but still not too big.
Right, looking down the questions again, there's a little bit of a context going on whether Europe or Scotland is better than Britain, but unless somebody wants to actually speak up on those, perhaps we'll move on. Because John Holden raised this point about tax. Do you want to come in there, John, and talk about it, or John Holden?
Well, what?
Yes, I can just do that. I mean, I put about £50 worth of petrol in the car at a time, and I looked up that the duty and the VAT on petrol is about 57p a litre. So I put about £50 in, £90 in if I'm driving a bigger vehicle. And that's quite an income to the government, particularly when I spend hundreds, if not thousands of pounds a year on petrol as a fuel to get around the country. Now, with an electric car, you charge it up at home, you're paying 5p VAT on your 20p a unit type price. If you go to commercial fast chargers in some of these areas, like garages or motorways, then you can pay up to 80p a kilowatt hour. But if this change happens, there's going to be a very, very large decrease in tax revenue for the Treasury if people are not buying petrol and not running their cars where they're £280 a year duty on the cars. What changes might the government bring in to recoup that, unless they spread that tax burden more widely and say, right, 7% on fuel, on electricity?
Yeah, I mean, I think so it's a good question. It's one that is recognised and thought about. I think best will in the world, we're still a few years away from this being a problem. Electric vehicles are growing rapidly at the moment, but from a very small base. So we're still quite a few years away from the point where actually the tax revenues really start impacting the government. But yeah, you've sort of got three choices, haven't you? Either you do have to reintroduce some kind of tax on electricity that's going into vehicles, so at which point the electricity gets more expensive, or government needs to raise that money from somewhere else, in which case other taxes go up, which our governments don't like doing very much, or our media doesn't like our governments doing. But the thing that is being talked about very seriously is road charging. And that makes a lot of sense, that actually you shift the tax burden from the fuel that you put into the car to the use that people make of the road system. Now, of course, you've got another big, huge IT challenge here around tracking vehicles and how that gets paid for. But I'd say that's probably the front runner that into the, let's say, medium-term future, expect to see more road charging and less revenue come through fuel duties. But it's a fair challenge for anybody that's acquiring an electric car now. Certainly if you're buying new, you're paying slightly over the odds because they're still quite expensive. and you're expecting to make some of that money back through saving on, significant saving on fuel costs. But you may find that in a few years' time, there's a bit of a leveling up between electricity prices and petrol and diesel prices.
Right. I'm hoping to wrap this up at about 8 o'clock, I think, because that's really quite a long time for everyone to have been on. I see we've got some more questions coming in down below. Not sure if we can wrap some of these up. Sarah Rigby talks about lots of things that I've certainly never met before. Sarah, would you like to join in and say something to us?
Oh, good evening, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to mention this. But yeah, this is just, and I have to say I work for Scottish and Southern Electricity Networks on their innovation project side of things. So this is all about us looking at what we can do with the network and of course accommodating electric vehicles. But the project I'm currently involved with is looking at whether we can improve security of supply for customers who are on some of our more vulnerable networks, so networks that have increased numbers of power cuts or longer power outages, things like that, using a battery energy storage system, which would need to be owned by a third party because currently distribution network operators aren't allowed to own a battery, and also any embedded or local distributed energy resources, whether that's generation or whether that's eventually vehicle to grid. So for example, if a local area has a power cut, the RAS concept would have that area supplied in islanded mode using the battery and any generation that's available. And of course, EVs could participate in that to either prolong the duration of the service that could be offered, or reduce the size of the battery that would be needed in the first place, in which case, that reduced costs. So there are so many other use cases for and by that I mean, uses for EV batteries that really open up a lot of opportunities for the market and for some of these more dynamic ways of operating the network with extra participants.
Right.
Good night, John. So Sarah, if you want to critique anything I said or get anything horribly wrong, but also while you were talking, did you see Julian's question come in of why a DNO is not allowed to own batteries?
Oh, no, thank you. I didn't see that come in. And no, nothing to critique. It's been a brilliant talk. Thank you so much. I really support all of this kind of thing. That's regulation. Batteries are classed as generation, and distribution. Companies with a distribution license from Ofgem are not allowed to own generation. So that's how Ofgem have decided that will work. And Ofgem want to see us using the market. This is all about, using market services to provide services rather than any kind of.
Of course, there's an answer I can give here that Sarah, you can't.
Okay.
You don't expect the electricity market to make sense.
Thank you, Phil.
No, you're not allowed to say that. I am.
Cheers.
Yeah, there are some ironies in what the different players in the system are allowed to do.
And I think as well there is a perspective of what somebody with an engineering or technical background might apply as a solution compared to somebody with a more economic background, where they look for a market-based solution. Would you agree with that, Phil?
Yeah, I would, and I'd say that we might be spotting a few chickens coming home to roost with the electricity supply market and gas prices at the moment. But there you go.
That's not for me to comment.
Righty, another question from Tim Chesterton about what's the impact on battery health from vehicle to grid or vehicle to home, frequent charge and uncharge. Is the technology there yet, and is it going to be?
Right. So yes, the technology's there. I mean, I mentioned the Western Power Distribution Electric Nation project. I think they're getting into the hundreds of V2G units that are being installed through that project. So the kit exists, it's being trialed. Some of them are working better than others, but it's coming and the crinkles are being ironed out. I think sort of a broad brush approach, we started getting a bit dismissive of the impacts on batteries of V2G because simply put, the driving cycle of what your car demands is so much more demanding on a battery than the kind of uses that we're generally thinking about in taking electricity back out of it and putting it into the grid. That for the most part, no, I wouldn't expect that it to harm the battery in any way. There are some more extreme cases. I mentioned the idea that we might get into using vehicles to prop up heating. And if you did end up doing that, you'd be using a lot more of the capacity of your battery on a daily basis. And actually that could begin to get into a problematic regime. Sarah's just alluded to territory that we'd need another few hours to cover, but the other kind of services that batteries might provide to grid support, some of them are looking for very fast acting, very high power services. And again, you wouldn't necessarily want to do that from a vehicle battery with the sort of the regular power electronics that's in it. But for the most part, I mean, I've got pretty relaxed about V2G, and I think it was a bit of a people looking for problems before the thing had really been researched kind of issue that was argued about.
Perhaps we can take this question from Steve Carpenter as the final question. Oh, Helen wants to say something, I suppose. So yeah, if we can quickly answer Steve's question about mini nukes, power Reading, different places and that sort of thing, or how they would implement themselves in the generation system. Is that something that you know about, Phil?
I have opinions about. So one of the worlds that I've learned about is the world of energy systems modeling and economics of generation. And one of the trends that has been well recognized by that community and that's played out over the last few years is that perpetually nuclear power has proved more expensive than we expect it to be, and renewables have proved cheaper than we expect them to be. And it's bizarre that it's so well known by that community that it still doesn't seem to be well factored into the modeling. But it started to play out in reality. You know, that our political masters have started to work out that actually renewables are cheaper, and that's one of the reasons we don't see nuclear power stations being built. The argument then runs that, well, this is because of an economy of scale thing, and it's because of modularity of construction, and therefore if we built lots of small modular nuclear reactors, they would be cheaper, wouldn't they? And because the people that argue for these things say, well, if we did it, they'd be cheaper, you then feed those numbers into the models with an assumption that they're cheaper, and the models tell you that they'd be a great thing to do. There are an awful lot of assumptions in there, and this is not remotely proven. And in a world where we do face lunatics out there who want to threaten all of us, spreading small nuclear reactors around our towns with all the security implications that come from that, I can't say that I'm keen. I think I would rather see some of the other bits of the jigsaw ahead of that.
Okay. So yeah, Helen had said that she would like to say a quick word before we close. Helen Lambert. Yes, hello.
Thank you. I wanted to say...
Who are you first, please?
Fine. I'm Helen Lambert. I'm the chair of the Caversham District Residents Association. And it's great to see Phil again. And we're looking forward to seeing you and Anthony on the 10th of November, and hope that we can reach some more people on this. Thank you.
Okay, quick advert then. Right. Well, perhaps we stop there, just on the stroke of 8 almost. Thank you very, very much, Phil, and for everyone else who's contributed. We'll look forward to carrying on this discussion in other fora in the future, I hope. So yeah, quick virtual round of applause to Phil, please. And yep, thank you very much and good night.
Thanks all for turning up. I mean, great participation. And